In this lecture, I will discuss quasi-experiments, which is a type of observational study that seeks to replicate some of the advantages of experimental designs. So what are quasi-experiments? So there are three characteristics of quasi-experiments in comparison with randomized controlled experiments. So first of all, unlike randomized controlled experiments, the researcher does not assign subjects into the treatment and the control groups. There are treatment and control groups, but the researcher isn't in charge of who is in which group. And unlike natural experiments, as well as RCEs, this assignment into treatment and control is not random. We can't assume that the two groups are equivalent, and so there are some differences between them. And third and finally, the researcher may or may not be the one that designs and administers the treatment. So this kind of study is definitely an observational study with all the limitations of an observational study, but there are some ways that they try to get around some of the flaws of observational studies. I'm going to go through two different types of quasi-experimental designs. The first is called the non-equivalent groups design. And with a non-equivalent groups design, you have two groups that are not considered to be equivalent. They're not assigned as if randomly or randomly into treatment and control. So you have these existing groups and you decide that one of them will receive the treatment and one of them will receive the control. And so in this kind of design, often the researcher is in charge of designing and administering the treatment. So one example here is one that we see in colleges and universities, in which they have two different pedagogies. So this is a study that looks at the effects of frequent quizzing on student performance. And you'll have two classes that are taught by the same professor, and one will say meet at 8 a.m. and the other will meet at 10 a.m. And one of them will have frequent quizzes every day to assess performance, and the other one will not. So you can compare these two groups. They have the same professor teaching them, but honestly, the students who decide to take an 8 a.m. class are not the same as the kinds of students who take a 10 a.m. class. And moreover, you might expect that some of the students in the 8 a.m. class might be a little sleepier. So you might find a difference between the students in the two groups based on who is some of these other potential confounds. And those are problems with the study, but they're basically inevitable problems because the researcher can't be at both places at the same time teaching two classes that both meet at, say, 9 in the morning. So here you don't have equivalent groups, but you could still use this design to get some sort of causal leverage to answer your question about whether having these frequent tests is valuable. A second type of quasi-experimental design is called the interrupted time series design. And so with the interrupted time series design, we compare trend before and after the administration of a treatment. So this graphic gives a little bit of a sense of what this looks like. You'll look at overall trends and see how they are doing on the outcome. And then you have an introduction of some sort of intervention, some sort of treatment, and then see what happens afterwards. So here you're really isolating that moment in time when the treatment is introduced. And here you're trying to get at that effect of having reverse causality. So here you're able to isolate when the cause is introduced and see the effect on that outcome. So an example, you might imagine somebody wants to look at the effect of war on students' education. And so you might look at children in Afghanistan and look at trends of educational attainment before the beginning of conflict in Afghanistan following 9/11. And so you would look and see what the overall trend is and see if these levels of education were in fact disrupted through conflict.